Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. My name is Tommy Johnson, and I'm with the Portland Regional Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to Growth Basics for Business, a monthly breakfast seminar series which provides a forum to gain useful do-it-yourself workplace solutions and insightful actionable tips. I want to thank Eaton Peabody Partners for their continued support of this virtual event series for the entire season. Now, before we get started, I'd like to welcome my new colleague, Rachel Carruthers, to Growth Basics. Rachel recently started at the Chamber as our new events manager and will be your host next month when I'm away in the ski bunker. Rachel brings over a decade of leadership and event planning and has already proven to be a great asset to our team. This is her first Growth Basics for Business, and this is the fifth installment for the calendar 23-24. This 10-part season-long series runs from September through June. And I'll invite Rachel just to say hello right now.
Thanks, Tommy. Yes, I'm very, very pleased to be a member of the Regional Chamber and very excited to watch him and experience my first Growth Basics for Business.
Thanks, Rachel. She's already proven to be an asset to our team, so you'll see more of Rachel in the coming months. Now, today's topic, how to navigate change, developing resilient leaders for success, is presented by my friend, Brad Peirce from Seed Strategies and the recently established Regenerative Change Lab. As a new era of business is emerging, one that puts as much emphasis on leadership, workforce development, and culture as it does our technical, operational, and financial approaches to navigate change. And we know with less than a third of employees that are currently actually engaged at work, it's clear that this business as usual approach is quickly becoming a thing of the past. Now, keep in mind, like all Chamber virtual signature events, this presentation is free and it will be recorded, and it's made available for free replay on the Chamber's website and YouTube page. To keep up to date on all the Chamber's news and events, please visit our website, portlandregion.com, check out our events page, and sign up for our weekly email newsletter while you're there. Before we get to today's presentation, I also want to remind everyone that we're continuing to use StreamYard for all virtual Chamber events. This platform provides many improved production and interaction elements that really enhance each event. I also want to remind you that if you have questions for our presenter, please type them in the YouTube chat and they'll be relayed to him throughout the presentation, and we'll save a little bit of time for more Q&A at the end of the event. Now, at this point, I'd like to acknowledge our presenting sponsor for Growth Basics for Business, Eaton Peabody. For the past 6+ years, Eaton Peabody has been the presenting sponsor of this series, and they continue their support this season. Now is when I would typically invite marketing manager Nate Levesque to say a few words, but he's at home with a newborn child, and I think he's enjoying that time as the snow falls this morning. But in his absence, I'll happily share that Eaton Peabody is a full-service Maine-based law firm with nearly 50 attorneys serving Maine clients from offices in Augusta, Bangor, Ellsworth, and Portland. They assist companies of all sizes in a variety of industries, so whether you're an established financial institution, a small business, taking the first steps, they can help you with all of your legal needs. To learn more about the services that they provide and the industries that they serve, please visit their website, eatonpeabody.com, and also be sure to follow them on Facebook or LinkedIn to stay up to date on legal updates and future presentations. Now, I'd like to introduce our presenter. With us today is Brad Peirce, who's the founder and principal of Seed Strategies and co-founder of Regenerative Change Lab. Brad has a background in sustainability, environmental and societal leadership, business development, and regenerative change. His organization's mission is to help professionals and leaders develop the courage, connection, and competencies to unleash their full potential. With that said, take it away, Brad.
Tommy, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you also to the Portland Regional Chamber of Commerce and Eaton Peabody. And of course, thank you everybody that's here this morning with us. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here. I'm just going to share my screen real quick here. Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. So this is something we do typically in the regenerative space, since I've been in it for a few years now. It's something we do at almost every gathering. It's a great practice. I encourage people to do this at the beginning of meetings. It's just a way to bring yourself into the space and kind of get out of your head and mind all that's going on for you in the day. So I invite you all, if you're able to sit up straight in your chairs and elongate your spine. Now, this might feel weird for some of you, and for others, it might feel very natural. Those of you that go to yoga and do these kinds of things. But I'm just going to invite you into a moment here, about 30 seconds of presencing and arriving here in the space. So if you want to close your eyes, you can do that. Just take a few deep breaths with me. And as you're breathing, I just want you to think about, I want you to notice your chest rising and falling. That's it. Just notice your breath. Just a couple more breaths. All right. I welcome you back to the space. And as you open your eyes and come back to the space, I want you to think about just one thing that you're grateful for today. Start the day out strong. So I'm from the Portland area. I've been here about 12 years, moved up here to run TD Bank Sustainability back in 2012, and love everything about Portland, especially this beautiful picture here. I just thought I'd start by just giving you a little bit of context about who I am. I've had quite a journey over the last several decades of life, and it's interesting. It does actually come full circle. I'm just going to describe it real quick. About 3 phases of my life, I would say, starting in rainforest conservation and in ecotourism in Central America, Costa Rica and Guatemala, specifically back in the late 90s. I was working with communities down there to help them both develop and maintain a lifestyle that would be in balance with living systems. So it was really got an early appreciation for systems and the interchange of systems between human systems and living systems. And how do we help make a balance there, make sure to protect the rainforest and allow people to survive? Years later, I moved into work in banking and sustainability specifically. And I really found a specific cause and calling around leadership development, culture building, because I love the people element of sustainability. I found that it was the most important way to help organizations move toward their goals is through their employees and through their stakeholders, to have that become part of the culture. And that was another way of looking at systems. I looked out and down across the systems that I was working in. And then more recently, I've become a regenerative leadership coach and consultant. Started a company called Regenerative Change Lab, as Tommy said. And interestingly, that brings me full circle back to living systems, which we're going to be talking about today. So let's talk about change, since we're talking about navigating change here. Change is something, obviously, that is increasingly happening around us. The complexity of changes. You might feel a little bit like this picture here on a bend, going very fast. Everything's moving by. I remember growing up, things seemed much more simple and certain and clear. And the world today just seems to be getting faster and faster. We have things like climate change, which are increasingly a concern for people. Pandemics happening. We have biodiversity loss. We have war and conflict happening around the world. And that's impacting your business and your everyday life. Supply chains, employees are feeling that stress too. The workforce changes. Many of you are familiar with this term, but a lot of people describe this as, it's kind of become a trendy term these days, what's going on in the world as VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. When I hear that word and I look at this picture, it makes me feel kind of stressful. It, sort of agitates my my vagus nerve inside of me. And those are unhealthy ways of feeling. And that can have an impact on you as a leader and on your employees, all this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. But what if those words actually weren't all that bad? And I want you to think about that for a minute. What if these words are actually something that are reflective of the world in which we live, the world in which our ancestors have lived for thousands of years, the world of living systems? What if we could use the turbulence instead of suppressing it in our everyday work? Let that energy flow through that turbulence to learn. What if we could be okay sitting in uncertainty when we feel that, when we're certain about things, we're often blind to the unknown? What if we could lean into complexity and what comes with that complexity in systems thinking, so that we can understand more about the systems in which we live and work? We can expand our horizons. What if we can be open to the fact that causal relationships are not always clear? That's the ambiguity piece. We could explore deeper meaning and connection between things that are not linear and reductive. It's interesting why I want to sort of spend a moment here and get to the root of why do we create such a hoopla around this word VUCA. Well, if you look at this is big history. This is looking back to the beginning of time. I love this graphic here. You can see all the changes and creation of the planet, early stages through which our biological history and the planet have gone through, extinctions. And right at the sort of right around 3 o'clock, you'll see human beings at the 11th hour kind of evolve here on this planet and go through our own stages of history. And when I look at this picture, I see a lot of VUCA right here. I see a ton of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. But yet somehow, as human beings, we tend to think that it's right here, right now, facing us. Oh my gosh, we have to deal with all this craziness in the world. It's been going on for a long time. This is a model that I use a lot in the course created called Regenerative Change Navigation. I think it's a really great way to sort of understand all that's going on around us, the complexity, why we think certain ways, why we think the way we do, and how we can start to move beyond this way of thinking to new ways of thinking to help us navigate this change today. So I'm just going to describe this model. It's called the 3 Horizons model. A guy named Bill Sharp developed it, but it was from many other ancestors and thought leaders before him. But it's a pretty simple tool. It's essentially 3 interconnected change curves that go through as change curves that go through birth, growth, dominance, decline, and death. And so if you look at the left-hand side where horizon 1 is the red line, that's kind of at the dominant stage, moving down toward the decline and death. And this red line right here represents the dominant paradigm that we're in right now. It's really kind of the past 300 to 500 years, the era defined by things like the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution, which gave rise to so much progress and prosperity for humanity in terms of healthcare and technology. And where we are today, we can really thank for this way of thinking. But it also created ways of thinking that were very egoic. They were linear. They were reductive in the scientific method of reducing to the parts, which sort of, doesn't help you sort of see the whole picture. We got very extractive, machine-like thinking, which came about. This created, I like this little dominant, sort of pyramid on the left, because it shows that, oftentimes man is kind of at the top. We think of ourselves as dominant over nature, that we're separate from nature, and all the other animals are below in value. And it's created this machine-like thinking also in hierarchical systems in our organizations, which are good. They're good for certain companies, certain things like the military. But when you think of a Jenga piece, you pull one little piece out, that whole system of blocks can fall down. It's not a very resilient system. If you look at the green line, Horizon 3, this is living systems. These are the nature-based wisdoms that have existed for billions of years and been carried through time, by our ancestors, and currently today still in indigenous communities around the world. This way of thinking is much more life-centric, not so human-centric, where everybody has a role, an important role to play in the whole system. And those are systems that are living systems like this that are nodal. And if you think about, like, if you took a scissors and cut one of those lines that were connecting those little nodes, it wouldn't collapse the whole system. It could still survive. And so there's actually that kind of thinking going on in organizations right now in Agile. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So we're kind of where we are in this curve. We're sort of down in the middle there, I would say. This blue line, Horizon 2, represents sustainability. This is the bridge between old ways of thinking that no longer serve us, because we can see it's happening. The world is starting to sort of cave in around us in many ways. Living systems are breaking down. Our own human systems and social environmental systems are breaking down. This living systems approach is going to be the way to get through, because it has billions of years of evolutionary wisdom. The sustainability bridge is what many of us are on today as we're building these solutions to help us get there. It's one step in the right direction. But it's interesting, there's some language too. If you notice culturally, you start to see a shift in language depending on where you are. And this is interesting because, many of us actually spend time in all 3 of those horizons. Those of us that are change makers especially, we tend to be idealistic, sort of in thinking about the future, where that regenerative future might be. We might be operating in the Horizon 2 of bringing sustainability solutions and change to our organizations to help them move toward what employees and stakeholders and shareholders and consumers want today. And also dealing with still entrenched systems, dominant ways of thinking that happen to be, again, not bad, but are tied to this sort of machine-like thinking. So I invite you to sort of look at these words here and sort of see if any of them resonate and where you might be shifting your own, sort of state of mind and communication with people as you go through your day, if you're in a change-making role, or if you're not. Where do you sort of resonate? Which of these horizons appeals to you or makes you feel like, yeah, I'm sort of squarely in that one? We have fun with these words in our course. Catch ourselves all the time. I'm constantly saying things like, let's mine the data. Let's leverage this. It's fun. At the end of the day, what do we really know? This gets to that uncertainty. I like this quote here. Every visionary of every era is still blinded by what they take as givens, and doubly humbling to realize that same holds for each of us along the miniature vistas of our everyday lives. So this picture on the right is actually the Earth at the center of the universe. We used to think that was scientific knowledge. We were at the center of the universe. What did we know? That was fact at the time, and that shaped the way we saw the world, the way that we developed our society around us. And I like to introduce this. This is an interesting way to think about what do we really know in this regard, because if we were to say every bit of knowledge ever in the entire universe, all of history, all future, past, present, could be combined, could be contained in this pie chart. This little red sliver pie piece is what we know. This green piece is what we think we know. This is what we know we don't know, this orange piece. And I would invite you, if I were in a sort of an interactive session with you, I'd invite you to guess what this blue piece is. Of course, that's, we don't know what we don't know. There's a lot that we don't know. In fact, when we even talk about the word know, that has to do a lot of times, we think about our heads. And that's why I invited you at the beginning to get out of your head a little bit. It's called embodiment. Get into your body, start to listen to other intelligences, because we have many other intelligences that are accessible to us as living beings, as part of living systems that we are. There's not just physical intelligence, mental intelligence, emotional and spiritual intelligence, and many other ways of knowing and experiencing the world. So I'll just pause there for a minute and see if there are any questions from the audience. Tommy, is anything coming through?
Hey, Brad. So nothing coming through the chat yet, but I do want to encourage people, if you do have questions for Brad, it may be something he's talking about, or maybe something you expect him to talk about, go ahead and type them right there in the YouTube chat, and we'll be sure to spend some time to get to them.
Awesome. I did want to give one quick example. So, people living in this third horizon, I'm going to go back to it, or living in these three horizons. So as I said, we created a course with my business partner called Regenerative Change Navigation, helping leaders and change makers, especially people in sort of sustainability roles and change making, understand where they are in the context of all these horizons, feeling okay with the fact that they might be straddling multiple horizons all at one time, because that can create a lot of burnout, anxiety, frustration when you don't sort of look at it objectively like this, and you're constantly running from one place to the other and speaking different languages to different people and trying to nudge the organization in forward towards sustainability, or even toward that sort of regenerative future that's aligned with living systems. There's a woman who works in healthcare, and she actually is a sustainability expert internally. She was one of our former participants, and she's constantly getting burnt out in this space. But she's working, for instance, in the hospital system on this horizon one on safety and regulations and hospital codes and all these things that they have to do to keep the hospital running as sort of a machine, really, essentially, if you think about it that way. But then also in H2, this horizon 2, she's also working in this disruptive innovation around using waste as a resource. So they take this blue wrap stuff that's everywhere, as in hospitals, and they've been recycling it into 3D printer tape, which is really cool. So that's sort of sustainability innovation to try to start to reduce waste. But in this horizon 3 way of thinking, she's also talking to people inside the organization, and she's oftentimes spending time there inside of her own self, thinking about sort of what is this organization in ecosystems terms. So she's mapping the ecosystems and the functional collaboration of people across the organization, creating webs of stakeholders, and thinking about this as a waste-wise hospital, just like Coca-Cola became a water management company. For those of you that knew, it was less about soda anymore because of the impact on water. So I'm going to move into the second stage of this this conversation today, or this presentation, I should say. It's very one way. I do encourage you to ask questions, please. Anybody that has any. But we're going to talk about what are living systems. So I'm talking about that third horizon. And I want to talk about it not as some sort of utopian future. This really is accessible to all of us. As I mentioned, we are part of nature. We are nature. We are living systems as much as nature is. Living systems live inside of us, and they live outside of us, of course. We call it our inner and outer ecosystems. And it's interesting for those of you that like to go out in the woods and spend time out in nature, you'll start to recognize, maybe after this especially, that you'll see lessons in nature that help you understand yourself better, and vice versa. You look inside of yourself, you start to understand the way the world works a little bit better. Again, stepping outside of recognizing and being aware of the mentality and the mindsets that we've inherited, that H1, the Horizon 1 kinds of mechanical, extractive type mindsets, and starting to recognize where these things are showing up. So I invite you to just sort of check out these words for a minute. I'm going to go into each one in detail in a little bit. But this is what's called the logic of life. I took this from a book called Regenerative Leadership. I'm a big fan of Giles Hutchins and Laura Storm. My business partner and I actually went on a year-long journey with Laura Storm. It's called Regenerative Leadership Journey in 2022. And I'm a friend with Giles Hutchins, he was a business consultant for many, many years. And then he got into this regenerative leadership, and he runs nature immersions over in the UK. And I'm actually running some here in the United States this year coming up as well, for those of you that are interested in retreats or nature immersions. But these terms are biological. He calls this the logic of life because they're biological. They use the logic of nature. And of course, as I said, nature has billions of years of evolutionary wisdom. It knows what lasts, what makes life possible. And there's a lot of different frameworks that address this, but I tend to like this one. So let's walk through these for a little bit here. And in with each slide, I'm going to give you an example. On the top, if you look at the right side, of human systems that reflect this principle. And then on the bottom side, we're going to have some nature-based examples, how nature shows up, how this principle shows up in nature. So principle 1, this is the overarching principle, creating the conditions for life to thrive. This is something Janine Benyus, for those of you that know biomimicry, use that, creating the conditions for life to thrive. Everything nature does is in service of life. So how can we start to think about that? Not just in service of humans, which of course in the office, of course, we're more human-centric, but how do we start to think about life in general, that circle that I showed you, that we are not at the top of that we are part of it, to continue to create those healthy systems. So that top system on the right is spaces that allow for flow and well-being, health and vitality, spontaneous interactions for life to thrive. A lot of these principles are baked into that space right there. So you can find your own spaces, or if you're a designer, design those spaces that bake in a lot of these principles. And you'll find they end up resulting in much more healthy systems than maybe traditional, the sort of, boxes that we've sit in the past, spaces. Bottom is a desert bloom. Life can show up pretty much anywhere, even in unbearable conditions like the desert, where you see this beauty. The second principle, ever-changing and responsive. This is really about our unique abilities to sense and respond to the dynamic feedback loops. Pay attention to that word. We'll get back to dynamic feedback loops and what's happening in our immediate environments and the broader ecosystems around us. And all that's in service of learning and growing and adapting and evolving. So if you look at the top right, as I mentioned before, sort of traditional hierarchical thinking led to this, the type of organizational chart that we see on the left. We're moving really today into more hybrid thinking, where there is a little bit more agility. There's these sort of semi-autonomous, decentralized teams. It's where a lot of innovation happens. It's where the organization starts to listen to the edges. Creativity flows through them, and they start to become a bit more, incorporates a bit more of that agility into the organization. And it's not, the far right, the living systems thinking, that nodal approach is not right for everybody, like I said. But as you start to sort of see yourself and your organization, your teams in that way, it does open up opportunities for innovation and creativity to align with things that can be much more resilient today, like the Murmuration, if anybody's ever been lucky to see one of those, the bottom right-hand corner of swallows, it's unbelievable. The way that they move, or a fish ball, insect swarms. How do they do that? Well, they're sensing and responding to their immediate environment and as a whole collective organism. There's actually something which we'll get to in a bit that is sort of a collective consciousness that's driving a lot of that as well, which a lot of times we're sort of blind to today. We think of ourselves as individuals, independent of everything else around us. So as you're just, by the way, as you're hearing these principles, I invite you to sort of think about how these show up in your life, in your teams, where it might spark an idea for how to do things a little bit differently to bring life back into your organization too. This is the relational and interconnected principle. It's about the interdependence of all things, all relationships nested together at the micro and macro scale. I like to think of this as the pause between the notes in a song or for those of you that are my age, the pause between the songs that kind of made the album as you're anticipating the next one. There was a relationship to those pauses. The relationship creates the beauty of the song itself. And if you look at this top picture here, this is, people relating to each other. These relationships are important. It doesn't just have to happen in person. I know a lot of companies are thinking about, how do we bring people back together? There is extreme value in having face-to-face, but you can do it over Zoom. And we do it through these Zoom meetings that we have in these gatherings by creating a space, an intentional space for connectivity. When you have breakouts, so people can connect, they're not being sort of big brother watched and listened to. They can actually have conversations on the side through these breakouts and back in large groups to share what they've been learning and hearing and talking about. Ants are a great example of this principle because they're so interconnected. There's no individual ant that's working on its own. They're always working in the service of the whole colony. And that was someone like E.O. Wilson, for example, gave us great insights into the nature of ants, for those of you that follow that kind of stuff. Principle 4 is synergistic and diverse. This is where the idea of sort of concept of diversity comes in, because there's something in life. There's a divergence and there's a convergence, which we'll get to that later, actually. But this is how life thrives. It's in diversity. Obviously, it's not just a checkbox exercise to have a gender or a race in your in your board or on your team. What comes with that is not just those things that make your diversity sort of checkbox exercise, but the diversity of thought and perspectives that come with that different person or gender or race. That's what's important. So it's this divergence that allows for diversity to happen, allows for us to expand that divergence. And with convergence, nature is the dance between divergence and convergence, constantly interplaying to create emergence. You have to have both. With just divergence, you spin out of control because you go, if you were just in an innovation stage, think about that, without having the convergence of bringing those thoughts together and creating a final product at the end of the day for that emergence to happen. But there's a tension there. And that tension between divergence and convergence we deal with all the time, politically, in our companies too, about how do we grow? How do we bring a project together and create closure? That tension is where learning happens. And that's where life learns, through that dynamic equilibrium. Principle 5, cyclical and rhythmical. This is about the patterns and rhythms of nature. These are the ebbs and flows of nature, about the cycles, respecting the seasonality of life, the cycles of birth and growth and death and decay and renewal and everything we do. And that's super important because, again, being part of living systems as an individual or as an organism, an organization, it's interesting those two words have the same foundation, organism, organization, which is a living system because it's made up of living people, that we're conscious of and thinking about seasonality in everything we do. And we'll get into that actually a little bit in a couple slides in the next section. Actually, so I won't do a little spoiler here, but just pay attention to that. This is principle 6, flows of energy and matter. This is about respecting life's natural flows and energy and matter that exist everywhere. All life forms and ecosystems, there's flows. Think of in a living system, oxygen, water, biomass, minerals, and nutrients. Those are all flowing constantly through systems. Most systems are open or permeable. There aren't that many closed systems in life. There are, but we tend to create these machine-like systems which are closed. Machines thrive in closed systems. Machines, that's how they function. That's how they're productive. And so there's a little bit of tension there between how we create our realities around us again, and how we are, whether we are not following the principles of nature in the way that we design things. So in organizations, flows of energy and matter would be people and groups and information, workflows, products, and ideas. So pay attention at, are you helping enable the flow of ideas and information, or are you blocking it in the way that you lead? And watch what happens when you do block energy, block flows. Tensions arise, people saying they're not sharing information, they're withholding information. There's a real tension that can exist. This top level, I like it because it's the top picture, because it's a picture of a train station where they are designed specifically for flow. People are able to move from one place to the other, and they design it so that you can get from one place to the other quickly and efficiently. And the bottom picture is a photograph of mycelium, which is, as some of you are into nature might know, this sort of the building blocks of nature. It grows down in the soil. We tend to think of the soil in a living system as, if we want to use that metaphor for a minute, of a tree. And the soil is the inner dimensions of ourselves. And as an organization, it's the culture, it's the soul, the soul of an organization. So tending to this mycelium, which now in permaculture, they're finding that the soil is the most important thing for the health and vitality of a garden or a farm, more than anything else. And you kill it by dumping pesticides on it and trying to control, again, that sort of machine-like controlling of farming. But when you start to let living systems do their own thing, that mycelium spreads nutrients between trees, even competitive trees, where it's needed. And it's even how some say, there's books out there that say that trees even speak, send chemical communication through the mycelium in the soil. So again, thinking of your organization, how do you promote that growth of the soul of the organization that can keep this thing, the organization, in a healthy and vital system. Principle 7. I love this one. This is living systems field. This is what I was speaking about before. For those of you that are into music or sports, you'll notice that there's something magical that happens when a sports team is playing at its best, or when I tend to like the Grateful Dead, and when I hear or any jam band for that matter, one of the reasons I love Portland. They get into a rhythm and a flow, and oftentimes if you speak to the musician after, they've played, I'm sure you've seen this on music documentaries, they say, I don't know where I was. I was on another level, another plane. I was experiencing something where there was unity between us, and it was an outer body experience. Well, that's kind of what this is right here. It's this all pervasive field that informs all of life. It's this collective intelligence, helps us sense into our higher purpose and connect with everything. It connects all of life, all relationships. Spiritually, you could call it Gaia or spirit, or got some God, universe, source, quantum. They're starting to find this nice interplay between quantum science and spirituality now, where it's not that different. I wanted to explain these pictures. Interestingly, you'll notice the top one is actually it's a microscopic view of human neurons, and the bottom one is a simulated image of dark matter in the universe, which it's supposedly the best photograph of our entire universe. And look at that, at the macro scale and the micro scale. Something about that. So I'll close this section by just saying, if you work with life-centered principles, the universe pitches in to help. It's by Buckminster Fuller, for those of you that know him. All right.
Hey, Brad.
Yeah.
Perfect timing for a question here. It goes like this. This new way of thinking may be foreign to some organizations. I mean, I know certainly here at the Chamber, we're a small staff. We're pretty much business as usual, and we go about things the way we've always done. What's the first step to approaching this topic with our employers, with management, just sort of bridging the idea of, we need to sort of rethink our place and purpose as we go about business?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tommy. I think doing some values work and purpose work, if you haven't already, is important. I think many companies like yours probably have done that on some levels. Sometimes it's interesting to have this kind of a short workshop like this, just to kind of tease the mind and think a little bit differently before you start to do that kind of work around values or purpose. And it might actually help you rethink things a little bit and start to say, how can we start to maybe tease out some of these living systems approaches in our organization? Where do we see it showing up? Where is it missing? Where are the parts of our organization or our leadership that we can develop in different ways that will enable this? I mean, ultimately, regeneration, it's another term, right? People say, oh my gosh, it's another term in this realm of sustainability. Ultimately, it's about creating healthy systems, both inside of ourselves and in the world around us. So I would say, ask yourself that question of, what do we need to be the most healthy, vital, thrivable organization for the parts, the individuals, and the whole collectively? And that's not just your organization, as you are. You're a collection of many members, so that's your ecosystem. That's your community. How can you be a vital member of a larger ecosystem in creating the health for that whole system?
Yeah, and I think this program today is a first start for us and for our members. But I was going to phrase this as a rhetorical question, as a follow up to that first question. Most of our leaders within the business community here in Portland, I'm thinking about our senior level CEO types. There's always ongoing leadership training. I'd like to think and hope that some of this type of thinking and mindset is being sort of permeated into some of the leadership training that's going on currently. I was going to ask that rhetorically, but if from your background in leadership training, is that something that you're seeing more often now, that leaders are being trained not necessarily just in the black and white, but also in the field of all sense living?
Well, that's a good question. There's many pieces of what I would call regeneration being trained in organizations and in leadership training today, like empathy, emotional intelligence, systems thinking. So that's just three I mentioned, but there are our collaboration. Obviously as I mentioned, the interconnected principle. There are many parts of it being taught. I would say what's missing for me, in my opinion, is that a lot of times things that are taught to leaders and brought into organizations are done so in sort of siloed ways. Again, it's just, we inherited this sort of silo type of thinking in that H1, the Horizon 1 I was talking about. We're all in it. We're all part of that. And so when you do that, sometimes you miss kind of the broader context and systemic view of why that specific thing is important. I'll tell you a story. I mean, for me, regenerative, I was actually going to, fighting a little cold here. I was going to tell this as part of the next section, which I'll elaborate a little bit more then. But when I was introduced to regenerative leadership a few years ago, it spoke to me, and everybody I've spoken to since then about it tend to have the same kind of reaction, like, yes, it's something I've felt in my bones and my DNA. Different parts of it really resonate with me. All these, we call it a big tent. There's many, many different disciplines that come together in this space of regeneration. It's, we've got quantum physics, we've got spirituality, we have consciousness work. You've heard of conscious capitalism, great work being done here in Portland already. We've got adult development built into that. We've got biomimicry and biology in general. You've got organizational design and development. All these fields of really contributing toward evolutionary growth are coming together and feeding this. And so for me, when I got introduced to it, I like to describe it as like a puzzle, and all the little pieces were parts of things that I loved and appreciated reading in the newspaper or magazines or watching on TV or reading about and learning about over my lifetime: spirituality, quantum physics, space, land-based stuff, biology. And it was just that last piece of puzzle that kind of clicked in place. And so regenerative leadership can be it's nothing more than a lens. It's not a framework or a model that you have to fit into your organization, but it's how do you start to look at life and everything else through that lens. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. Hey, and Brad, while we have a second here, I know we're going to stop for some questions here and there throughout the presentation, but specific to this last chapter that you just did, regarding living systems beyond our work lives. We're all living creatures with homes and families, partners, and pets. How do we balance the idea of living systems in our personal life with that in our professional life? So, whereas before we were asking about how can we introduce this topic to management, but how can we, personally be able to bring this into our own consciousness at home, but also when we're at the office?
Excellent. Yeah. So I think getting into nature is one. I mean, if you're not already sort of attuned to nature and the way that you look at nature, I think getting out into nature and starting to just observe and pay attention to the way the seasons are changing. We're going to talk about seasons in a second. And ask yourself why. Be really curious about how things work in nature, and you'll start to actually realize stuff. You'll see many, many lessons for leadership at work and for your personal life. A lot of it has to do with just starting to change the inner dynamics of how you think and how you see the world. I think the next section will actually answer a lot of that. If we talk about the seasons as one good example, and then you can bring that into your personal life and to work. How about that?
Perfect. And I'll sign off for now. We have no more questions, but keep it up, and we'll catch back up in a few minutes.
Okay, Tommy. Thanks. So, this is using, I'm just sort of honing in on one of the principles right now. For example, the cyclical and rhythmical principle, and using seasons. This was something that resonated a lot with people in our course. When I've done follow-up, call them spotlight interviews. It's called Voices from the Field. You can look it up on YouTube, Regenerative Change Lab's Voices from the Field. So we have these little 5-7 minute spotlight interviews of participants who've been through the course and what insights they carried away with them and how they're applying what they learned in the course to their jobs and to their life. And many mentioned the 3 horizons and how that sort of shifted their way of thinking about things and understanding where they are in the concept of time and space. But also the seasons really resonated with people, specifically the winter. So I'm just going to go through this, and I'll get back to that in a second. But if you start to look at, obviously we're familiar with the seasons. We're here in a 4-season climate here in Maine. But you start to think about how this shows up in your life, in your work, in projects, and it's not just linear. Again, we have to catch ourselves because we can be sometimes thinking linear ways, or it's just here or just there. But it can show up in this complex world in multiple different seasons. You can have a project that has multiple people that are in multiple seasons in their life. You can have multiple projects across the organizations that are each in different seasons. You can have organizations that are in different seasons throughout the year. It doesn't have to be tied to the calendar year, but you really need to be thoughtful about this as you're going about, leading and looking at yourself and your teams. And so I'll just quickly go through it. So the fall, the autumn is the harvesting and composting. Letting go, so important. People forget to let go. They have projects that are consuming resources and they're just hanging on to them because they do. Instead of saying, can we let go of this and open up those energy and materials, that other principle, flow of those things into other projects for more creative innovation, especially as we're facing the world as it is today. And we're going to need to be a bit more nimble. We have to be able to let go of some of the things from the past. And that goes for ourselves too, inside of ourselves. What can we let go of? Ways of thinking, unlearning these things that we have inherited. And recycle. There's parts of old things that you can compost some parts of it, you can recycle these bits and pieces of it too. So it's not like letting go of things entirely. You're learning from that. What did I learn from this situation? That's the convergence piece. As we move into winter, I'm going to go down from autumn to winter, and it's about reintegrating and renewing. So reconnecting with our inner ecosystem. It's so important to take time to rest. We do it on weekends, maybe sometimes, although many of us are busy, playing sports or going skiing or with kids. It's not always restful. It's so super important to revitalize yourself, take time for reflection, to go deep inside of yourself and to learn. And this is part of, as an organization, the learning and leadership development. HR people, you're going to love this. I mean, it is super important. And I know it's increasingly important in organizations that are putting resources toward leadership development and learning. But that is how you start to, you maintain that evolutionary curve. And then moving into spring, once you saved up and stored up enough energy. If you think about a tree, actually go back to that metaphor. So a tree, drops its leaves in the fall. I'm going to use that metaphor throughout this. Lets go of what it no longer needs, doesn't need to photosynthesize anymore. Nutrients go into the roots. Again, the soil, the soul, that inner development work, or an organization, learning and development. Then in the spring, you have all this stored energy that allows for this rapid innovation and growth to happen. We tend to sit in this world here, and it's so focused on, growth and GDP and constant productivity. And as a leader, you have to be conscious of this, because the more you start to, push people down that path of constant productivity and excessive growth, people burn out and they quietly quit. So give them, and projects and people and teams, the ability to rejuvenate, get into this period of growth where it's needed and when it's the right time. And then, of course, going into summer, above the top right-hand quadrant, collaborating and sustaining. That's when, bees are buzzing around and all life is kind of working together and collaborating with sustained energy to continue to bring abundance into the world. Abundance is a great term I'm going to pause on for a second here, because another fallout from Horizon 1 thinking, and I do it all the time, is what's called scarcity thinking. And it came from, again, fear-based things that have been built into us, hyper competition, us versus them kind of thinking. Again, this is all over hundreds and thousands of years of our human evolution. But in that scarcity mindset, that's the tragedy of the commons, unfortunately, is we think, I got to do what's best for me, because if I don't do it, somebody else will. And so we start to see things like nature and resources as scarce, and we hoard and we over extract. But at the end of the day, if we can let go of that stuff, we'll find that nature is abundant. And that's something Tommy asked, like, how do I bring that to work? I found, since I've been in this regenerative work, so much more energy and peace of mind, knowing that nature, that the world, that this, call it that, that final principle of living systems field, but it's going to provide for me, that it will happen. It's sort of a conscious shift, appreciative inquiry kind of shift. So I'm going to move for the last maybe I guess I have 10 minutes, but maybe 5 minutes. We'll just kind of touch on something. This is going to be quick. There's a lot to this, but one of the things that really changed my life, I'd say 3 or 4 years ago, was this called the IDGs, the Inner Development Goals. I'm going to introduce them in 1 second, but I was researching for a podcast I did called Sustainability Mind Shift, as I started to think about what is it that leaders need to be fully in a mindset of sustainable thinking, not just the sustainable practitioners in organizations, but all leaders across the organization. That was my frustration. I was like, why isn't everybody thinking about this? It's not a job like marketing or operations or finance or HR. It's really a mindset and a way of being and showing up and making decisions. And why are more leaders not doing that? I was frustrated in my previous work at a bank, and people had the right intentions and values and vision for the bank to be a green bank, but they weren't making daily decisions that reflected that. And that frustration led me to dig deeper in research around what I called sustainability mind shift. How do we actually help people develop those underlying mindsets that I've developed over 30 years of working in this space? And I'm lucky to have had that. I can't expect other people to think the same way that haven't had those experiences. And in researching sustainability mind shift, I came across a thing called the IDGs, the Inner Development Goals. And what that is, let me introduce them here. These are complementary to the Sustainable Development Goals. For those of you that have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals, it's a global sort of standard, if you will, trying to help all organizations commit to addressing these higher-arching challenges in the world. And they're systemic challenges like hunger and poverty and education and climate change, biodiversity loss, and water. But we're finding over, since they've been around for over a decade at least, that they're not as easy to fulfill and achieve as they had hoped. And it's turning out that it's because it's not that, we have the policy and the technical solutions that we oftentimes put our energy and thoughts into and time. For those of you that are familiar with conference parties, we just had that, and people are frustrated every year that they're not achieving anything. All these heads of state are coming together and, little is coming out of it. Well, it's because they're realizing that we're lacking these skills, these interdimensional skills, that sort of wintering aspect, if you will, that allow us to collaborate, that get us out of that Horizon 1 mindset and more into a Horizon 2, Horizon 3 mindset, that get us out of this scarcity and this, fear of the VUCA world, and actually leaning into those things like complexity and uncertainty, so that we can learn from each other and we can communicate and we can look more equitably across the world and see how do we achieve, a sustainable future together as a human race. And so this really opened my mind when I found the Inner Development Goals. I'm part of a couple groups here in Maine. So by the way, it's a global organization based out of Sweden, started a few years ago. They're research based. They have thousands of academic institutions and researchers that are putting, which we'll show you in a minute, the finding what skills are necessary for this future fit to be resilient leadership. And there's groups that meet regularly. If you're interested, let me know. I can introduce you to people. I'm part of global groups. There's regional groups. I ran a North America group last year. There's a couple here in Maine that I'm a part of, talking about the Inner Development Goals, where they're showing up, where there's gaps. And there's a summit every year. I went to this one in Sweden last October. It was fantastic. Here are the Inner Development Goals. I'll just sort of spend a few minutes here. Again, this is ripe for each one of these dimensions. There's 5 dimensions, ripe for workshops in your organization. And it's around, as I mentioned earlier, around things that you might already be doing, like emotional intelligence and inner compass kind of work. But it's in the context of this much bigger picture, which brings that context in. It's why I love it so much. So that you're not just developing those skills in isolation, but you're developing in the context of the bigger why. There's 5 dimensions here: being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. I'm just going to sort of show you more specifically the next 5 slides, these different dimensions. We don't have time today to go through each one of these, but I would recommend, if you're interested, reaching out to me. I'd be happy to talk to you about how do we bring this either into your life as the coaching side of me, to your team or your organization as a consultant, to focus on 1 or 2 or more or all of these skills within these dimensions. All important. Again, it's a living, breathing, call this a document right now, but they have a survey too. If for those of you that are interested, they're doing this was all based on their first survey they did a few years ago. Now they're running another survey now that they've expanded their influence and their outreach across the globe, especially from the global south. They're getting more voices heard there to see if any of these skills, if there are any additional skills that can be identified that are not already in these lists. So this is the being. This is the most important. I think someone asked that earlier. It's like, what is the most important skill? I would say starting with the being, the relationship to the self, that wintering, that taking the time to know yourself and see yourself as part of a much bigger system. To develop that inner compass, that very first skill there. It's something I've done over the last few years, spent a lot of time in nature trying to develop my own inner compass to help me navigate through change. So I don't just react to everything as it happens, including my family relationships, kids, wife, all that stuff. Like, how do I maintain that inner compass, that steady pace, energy flow to keep going? That's what it's all about at the end of the day. How do we keep going and not react or give up? Here's the second dimension of thinking, have to do with all these cognitive skills. So I would recommend just taking a look at that and seeing if any of these specifically stand out for you. I'm going to move through to the next slide so we can just leave a couple minutes at the end here. Relating. Collaborating. All very important skills for resilient leadership through these changing and challenging times that we're all facing together and acting. Okay. Thanks, Tommy.
Brad, great presentation. And listen, we've got one more question that popped through. And the question is, are there examples of organizational leaders that are working with employees to help foster and develop those IDGs, those individual development goals? Yeah, can you think of a situation where you've seen successful organizations that have had leaders, sort of identify that employees have these very unique IDGs and sort of how they can, sort of play that hand?
Yeah, I haven't seen anything yet in the US. There's a lot of companies and organizations in Europe doing a lot of work around this. They tend to be the ones that are already subscribing to, I'll use that word, it's not really a subscription, but subscribing to the SDGs, that are following the SDGs, that have built that into their sustainability reporting. And they recognize that there's a gap in leadership skills in this, to achieve these things. Let me just put up, by the way, I forgot to share I'm going to share my last screen so people that want to get in touch with me can do so. Let me just do this here, Tommy. I wanted to look at your face, but just to share real quick, there's a QR code right there. So that'll link you right to the Regenerative Change Lab. And there's my email and phone number for those of you that are interested in reaching out. I'd love to have a conversation. My door is always open. Let me get back to you, Tommy, here. Just going to click back here.
Yeah, and that's great. I do encourage people to reach out to Brad. And again, we will send out a post-event email to everybody who registered. Some people may not have been able to participate today because of whatever reason, but whether it was weather-related or whatnot. But the event was recorded, as I mentioned, and Brad's information and hopefully his presentation will be available in that wrap-up email as well. Brad, thank you very much again for a great presentation. It's a different way of thinking, I know, for a lot of us. I love to start the new year with a different mindset every year as I go further into my career. And this was really a really good one for me to sort of really rethink sort of how I'm personally approaching, my leadership and my approach to what I do day to day. But I did want to say thanks again to Brad and, of course, the Chamber staff for helping to produce another successful event. And thanks to each of you for attending today and throughout the year. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, be sure to check your email for that message. And there'll be some links to additional resources as well. Another shout out to our sponsors at Eaton Peabody for their support of Growth Basics for Business for this entire series year. We look forward to seeing you again on February 13th for the next Growth Basics for Business on another important topic to help you. The Eaton Peabody Growth Basics for Business series is typically held on the third Tuesday of each month. And with that said, have a great rest of your day. Get outside and stay warm.